Well, hey guys, welcome to the Renaissance. Uh, for these dates, there's a lot of different dates depending on which authors you read when this starts. I happen to prefer the 1450 AD date because that is very close to the beginning to the invention of the printing press, which I think is a great symbol for the Renaissance, right? However, depending on the author you read, it could be 1400. I even read one source that said it starts in 1300. Now, remember how this works. They use different starting dates, and a lot of times that's based on what they use as a symbol. And actually, I think the symbol of the printing press is perfect for Renaissance. So 1450, I think, is pretty good, although I certainly can understand why someone might say it starts earlier. The ending date would be about 1600, not because that's a perfect date to end the Renaissance, but because it's a perfect date, really, to start the Baroque, which we'll talk about in the next section. So 1450 to 1600, depending on who you read, 1400 to 1600, or maybe 1300 to 1600. Renaissance means quite literally rebirth or reawakening. I guess the question is rebirth of what? And so I guess our answer would be, as they saw it in the Renaissance, the rebirth of humanism. At the end of the medieval period, things were kind of going bad, and they thought they're going to reinvent their society. Now, you can start with something new, which is really hard, or you can just use something you used before, which is easier a lot of times. And they looked back and they looked at Rome and Greece before the medieval period, and they said, oh, well, that looks like a humanistic society to me. What is a humanistic society? Well, the short answer would be a more secular society as opposed to religiously dominated society of the medieval period by the Roman Catholic Church. What they saw as they looked back from the Renaissance was a society they thought was glorified individuals, individual achievements, as opposed to God or God's instrument on earth, the church. No, and that's not to say the church goes away. Of course not. But what it does do is establish now a sacred and a secular track in the Renaissance that we will talk about. Humanism, and as a result of that, because we do glorify individuals in a humanistic society, you're going to recognize some of the names here. I mean, look, listen to Raphael, Michelangelo, Da Vinci, Shakespeare. I mean, these are all guys that you would recognize as geniuses or whatever, and we certainly recognize their genius more easily in a secular society. We glorify it, if you will. This is also the age of exploration. This is Columbus, Magellan, and others, right? European exploration, I guess I should say. Of course, the big event during this period is the Protestant Reformation. This is a big deal, guys. This is an earthquake. Okay. Of course, we'll have to talk about Martin Luther and other things that come along with the Protestant Reformation. Uh, on the secular track of things, we start to see things like a secular education as opposed to religious education, and of course, the invention of the printing press and things like this. Okay, so how does music change? For almost 1,000 years, they wanted the music to be unemotional, really, or detached, if you will, prayerful, meditative, solemn. And because at the end of the Roman Empire, they thought they knew what happened, why the Roman Empire fell apart is because they were too decadent. And so we don't want all that stuff, no big parties or anything like that. So, uh, after 1,000 years and things aren't working so well anymore, they decide, hey, we want to change this, and we do want more emotion in in our arts, and specifically, we're talking about music here. But interestingly enough, not just secular music, even though they're writing dance tunes and love songs now. This also includes the church. The church fathers wanted there to be more emotion in the church music and to be more emotionally involved in the church services. And so this is what they do. Now, from here on out, really, till the end, with a little bit of a step back in the classical period, we are talking about uh, uh, developing have a bag of tricks that you throw stuff into to make your music more emotional, to provoke more emotions in people listening to it. Well, what are we doing here? Well, okay, the big thing, I guess, would be the technique of word painting. Word painting means quite literally the music does what the words say. Now, what's you have to keep in mind here is that this is quite literal. Okay, so now I'm going up a hill, now I'm going down a hill. Okay, that's easy enough. But sometimes we do things like sarcasm or something like that, and we're saying one thing and mean another. Word painting doesn't take that into consideration. Okay, so sometimes the music might seem a little naive, or maybe it's not projecting quite new if you look at it, but that's because it is doing literally what the words say. Okay, but this is a big step forward in applying techniques that provoke more emotional reactions. Some other things, the music becomes more fluid. We get rid of the sharp edges of medieval tunes. We make them nice and smooth and arcing. We like long arcing lines. We find that beautiful. Imitation. When we imitate something, we understand that it's connected. And when we hear connection like that, we hear repetition and imitation. It provokes an emotional reaction. We have two types of imitation. We have strict imitation, which is canon, like around, row, row, row your boat gently down the stream. Or we can have what's called free imitation. This is where most of the real work comes in. So you start the same, row, row, row your boat, and then the second voice comes in, row, row, row your boat gently down the stream, or whatever you're going to do. It's different than the first one, but we know they're connected because they started the same. Another technique they added was getting rid of all these different texts and different voices, 2, 3, 4 lines, all with different texts, even different languages sometimes. Not going to do that. Everything's all in one language, one set of words. Okay. And when homophonic style comes in, they're going to be all at once. Okay. The result of this is when we start heading towards homophonic style is this idea of chords and chord progressions. Now, this sort of emerges gradually as they're layering tunes one over the other, but sometimes when you have tunes layered in its long notes, you hear these chords and you start to hear how one chord might lead to another. This eventually will lead us towards chord progressions like we think of in traditional homophonic music. Homophony, what is homophony? Okay, so we had polyphony, which is one tune layered over another. So 2 or 3 or 4 different tunes or voices going at the same time. Homophony, we have one tune, one basic tune with accompaniment. So usually we think of that in terms of harmonies, but all the words are being said at the same time so that we can hear the words. But it still sounds cool because we have a tune which we can get real easy enough. We don't have to listen to more than one, which is always hard. But we have two harmonies that can make the tune sound better, and yet we don't have trouble understanding it. We have when this happens, we're going to have a chord progression. We create these chords. We start to notice how one chord seems to be pulled towards another. This is leading us towards major minor system. Um, and things like cadences become more obvious. A cadence, remember, is musical punctuation. Okay, a place where you stop and you say, okay, you digest what's happened. I say, I get it, and then we move on. Okay. Now, we've already talked about word painting, so that's important. And right now, I probably, before we go any further anyway, we need to talk about the Mass. Now, why would we worry about the Mass? Well, remember, one of the things that's important about form or structure is it helps us not only understand what is going on, but also many times a form or structure can have a built-in emotional reaction in the audience if they really understand what's happening here. And that's true of the Mass, of course, because especially before the split in the church, we would have everybody was Catholic in Europe, at least officially. Okay, and so they would know how the Mass works, and so you have like this built-in structure that can help you write music that is effective emotionally, in this case, religiously. Okay. Um, there are essentially two types. There are several sections in the Mass. Some are between 17 and 21 sections, depending on the season, the event, or whatever. So it does vary some, but some things are always there, and that would be the ordinary of the Mass. And this would include the Kyrie, the Gloria, the Credo, the Sanctus, Agnus Dei, and the Ite Missa Est, which means the Mass is ended. But some sections change based on the season or the event, like a Requiem, which is a funeral mass, a mass for the funeral, and these would change according to the season or event. So these parts that change are called the proper of the Mass. So we have these two sections that are either staying the same, which would be the ordinary, or the change with the season or event, that is the proper of the Mass. The churches finally saw the handwriting on the wall and realized there's just no way they're going to be able to keep people from writing their love songs anymore. So they said, okay, fine, go ahead. Just stop putting it in our religious music. And so people do start writing secular music, love songs, dance tunes. And the result then is not only we have nice love songs and dance tunes, but also some really gorgeous religious music emerges from the Renaissance, because now it's not all muddied up by these other words in there, that don't belong in a religious context. A couple of types of masses, events, if you will, that should be important for you to know would be like the Passion, which is officially the Passion is any story that tells the events leading up to the crucifixion of Christ. Okay. Um, the official ones in the Bible are the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But technically, any story that talks about the events leading up to the crucifixion of Christ could be considered a passion. Now, when you drive around parts of America, you will find that there's a passion play this weekend. Well, that's what they're doing. They're telling the story of the events leading up to the crucifixion of Christ. Quite oftentimes, they're done as musicals. Not always, but oftentimes. This would be either with music or without music, doesn't matter. This is a passion. And I've already mentioned the Requiem Mass. This is a Mass to eulogize the dead. Okay, so it's a funeral service. Okay. Um, okay. All right. The big event in the Renaissance is the Protestant Reformation. Oh boy, yeah. Officially in 1517, Martin Luther posted 95 theses on the wall of his church, on the door of his church, excuse me, and complaints about the church. And then, sometimes if you're reading your typical high school history textbook or something, you think, well, all of a sudden that's it. It's all over. We're lopping off heads with swords and everybody's killing each other. Well, that does eventually happen. Excuse me. But it doesn't actually happen right away. Now, what's going on here is not maybe as obvious as you might think it is, because first of all, you need to know Martin Luther was a priest, a very pious man, and he had, at the beginning anyway, had no intention of starting a new church. What he wanted to do was fix some of the issues that were going on in the church, issues that we had that led to the problems at the end of the medieval period, right? So that's what we wanted to do. Now, why did he post it on the door of the church, though? That's provocative, right? Well, actually, what he was doing is advertising a class, because he was going to teach a class about these things. So, unlike me, I'm lucky enough to have the college round up students to talk about history. Martin Luther would do it himself. Okay, and his particular class was about these issues, and and of course, I think he didn't mind they were provocative a little bit, because of course that gets people's attention, right? Fastest way to make something a hit is to make it controversial, right? If you read about what these 95 theses or 95 complaints are, I won't go through all 95, but some of the biggies are, of course, indulgences. Now, what's an indulgence? An indulgence is a sheet from the Pope that says the Pope has talked to God, basically, and has signed it, that forgives you of your sins, and that means that you can go straight to heaven and your sins are forgiven. No stop anywhere else, in purgatory anywhere else. Okay. They've been around for centuries, guys. The church has had indulgences for a long, long time. So why is it a big deal now? Well, it's a big deal now because before, let's say I would come up to you and I say, hey, I can give you an indulgence. We'll cancel out your sins and send you to heaven. Just all I need is $10 from you or something like that. But then they come back and they say, okay, later on, you can go to heaven, but now I need $10,000 from you. What? Well, okay, it's a lot of money. And why is that? Well, during this time, amongst many other things, they were trying to raise money to remodel St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. And by the way, guys, if you go see this, if you ever get to go to Italy, you got to go see St. Peter's. It's gorgeous. I looked it up, and this was a few years ago. Actually, the replacement value of that church a few years ago was $2 to $3 billion, and so now probably more. So yeah, I mean, they needed a lot of money. Okay, and this was one way they wanted to raise it, was through indulgences. Another problem, another thesis that was on there was the church abuse of property ownership. The largest landowner in Europe at this time was the church. Okay, and not only that, they were the largest landlord. Okay, because many of the properties that the church owned were properties where people lived and where they grazed their cattle and raised crops, and they had done that for generations. Same thing that kind of happens with indulgences, though. Um, they'd done it for years for really cheap rent, basically, and then all of a sudden, the prices go through the roof, and if you don't pay up, you're out. And they would throw people out. Oh boy, you can see where that would cause some problems. Some of these, like communal grazing lands, have been used by the community for generations. Wow. Okay. So this was another problem. Another one is the church involvement in politics. Um, the church felt they had the right to determine who had the right to rule a country, and this is a precedence that they felt had been established earlier, highlighted by the crowning of Charlemagne emperor of his empire. Well, okay, there's some controversy about that and what actually happened, but that's how the church felt about it. And so they interfered, and sometimes quite controversially, I guess we'll say. Eventually, we'll talk about the development of the Jesuit order. The Jesuit order basically is their charge is to protect Mother Church at all costs. Okay, and unfortunately, it led to some really pretty nasty stuff. We're not even, not just lobbying. We're talking bribes. We're talking assassinations. Oh boy, it got so bad that many countries actually threw out the Jesuit order. And at one point, the Jesuit order was disbanded because its reputation had been sullied so bad. Now, much later, they reconstituted the Jesuit order, and one of our recent popes was actually from the Jesuit order. And when he first got elected pope, a lot of people were concerned because they thought, "Oh no, does this mean the church is going to be involved in politics again?" Not like we're talking about back in the Reformation area time. um, okay, so eventually Martin Luther realizes that the church isn't going to be able to change. It's a big institution, really hard to change. A lot of people recognize there were issues, but it's just really hard to change a very large institution like that. And so it ultimately leads to Martin Luther to realize that he's going to have to start a new religion of his own. And they start this Protestant or Protestant church. And basically, he starts his Lutheran church at Martin Luther, right? And this is why a lot of people will say that Lutherans are more Catholic than the Catholics, because what he was doing, he thought, was making the church as it should be. Okay, so he creates this new Protestant church. He's not the only one, though. There's Calvin and others in Switzerland, and so this whole Protestant movement is a big deal. It sweeps across, especially northern parts of Europe, and it starts the 30 Years' War, because what happens is eventually the Pope sends armies to reconvert people back to Catholicism. So this war starts out as Protestant armies fighting Catholic armies, and at the end of the war, though, this is the first war that probably includes every country in Europe. Now, why is that? Because at the end of the war, we've got Protestant armies fighting Protestant armies and Catholic armies fighting Catholic armies. What's going on here? Well, this is a war for power, guys. The church is showing weakness, and people are trying to step into the power vacuum. And of course, secular authority, kings and queens, aristocracy, whatnot, were taking advantage of this to increase their own authority. Okay, well, this leads to 30 Years' War. Quite an ugly affair. And guys, I mean, it doesn't end well at all. They didn't have a truce or anything like that. It's just they kind of basically just ran out of people to kill. I think maybe the typical symbol for this would be the poster I've seen a couple places where it's It's like a or a cornfield that's been harvested. It's dry, in the wintertime. There's a pool of blood with a sword stuck in the middle of it in the ground. This would be a good symbol for the 30 Years' War. They just basically kind of killed almost everybody in certain regions. So there you go. At least a third of the population was killed. Maybe in some places more than half. Wow. Okay, let's see. Is there anything else? Well, and then of course, what's another thesis that I'll throw in there is cultural conflict between the Germans and the Italians. Martin Luther and Calvin and these others, these were mostly German-speaking countries we're talking about that switched to Protestantism. But the reason they were arguing is the Catholic Church would send a priest up for their church or whatever, and he only spoke Italian or Latin, and he didn't even speak their language or something. For example, I mean, and how could he even know about us or help us at all? And you can't even understand what he's trying to say anyway. And so these are just some of the issues, okay, and all kinds of issues relating to corruption and stuff like that. Okay, so that's what these theses are about. There's many more of them. I won't talk about all of them, but those are some of the big ones. Now, as it turns out, this newfangled Protestant church is actually turns out to be very popular. Now, why is that? Well, they did some changes that did make it popular. Okay, one, all the services are being held in the vernacular. What does that mean? The language of the people who are attending the church. So, for example, in Germany, they switched from Latin, which was the language of the Catholic Church, to German, so that the German people could understand it. And hey, if you want emotional engagement, you want people to understand what you're saying, right? So they speak in Latin. They had no idea, or Italian. They didn't know what that even meant. But now we say all of a sudden, oh, you in German that you have sins. Well, okay, I get it, and I'm going to be engaged, right? So that's one thing. They wanted everybody to participate in the music along with the rest of the service. And so, how do we do this? Well, okay, like every time a church leaves another church, they take the stuff they like with them, the good stuff. So they had their favorite tunes they took with them, and then or translated them to the language of the vernacular for these churches. But also, they wrote some new ones. They tried to make them catchy. They took folk songs that were popular, changed the words, and turned them into hymns. And you know what? Even beer drinking songs, guys. People go out drinking on a Saturday night, lift up their beer. Hey, there you go. Uh, and then the next day, that same song, different words, but the same tune. Well, hey, I'm engaged now, right? So there you go. Um, there's this and a few other things that make this church actually really popular. Oh yeah, in terms of this music, I guess I should be specific about that. Not only was it in English, and they write tunes that people like, but also they started writing things in homophonic fashion, and they would put the melody in the soprano because remember, it's easiest for us to hear the high stuff, and then the other harmonies were there. If you're talented or been trained or something like that, you could fill in the harmonies. Otherwise, everybody just sing what the sopranos are singing because you could hear it, just follow along with them, and therefore everybody could and would participate. Okay, and they thought it was fun. Um, okay, so these are some of the things that are going on in the Protestant church. Now, I'm just dealing mostly with the music. Of course, there's other issues, political and religious and otherwise. But at any rate, this goes on for a period of time, and eventually it becomes obvious that the Protestant church isn't going away. Okay. In order to respond to this, the Catholic Church formed a council, which is what they do, and they tried to come up with rules or rules of engagement, if you will. This is called the Counter Reformation, the Catholic Church response to the Reformation. Okay. So the Counter Reformation, now, that would have been fine too. It might have helped the whole situation, except that, of course, when you get a bunch of people get together and they've all got opinions, it took them decades to work this out. So 2 or 3, maybe even 4 generations would grow up not even knowing what was going on in the council. So it was just the same old stuff for decades. Now it's a well ingrained habit or pattern, right? So yeah, well, I won't. couple of things. I won't say too much about the church because it doesn't really change much because, but one big decision they came to was that the language of the Catholic Church is Latin. So they kept the church services in Latin. That did not change until the 1960s, sometime with Vatican II, and in the 60s is when Catholic Church also started having church services in the vernacular. Okay, and it's a very, very powerful tool, guys. So you can understand why they eventually decided to do this. But back then, they wanted to keep the language of the church as Latin. Musically speaking, they what they did basically was brought in a really good musician to make a template for the music they want to use in the Renaissance, excuse me, in the this in the Catholic Church, not new, but new music. And again, they brought in a guy that was a great musician. His name was Giovanni Pierluigi da Palestrina. Uh, don't call him Giovanni. If you wanted to choose one name, say Palestrina. We know who that is. Giovanni, that's like saying George. You know, how many Georges are there? I don't know. But Palestrina is his last name anyway. And so you say, well, okay, Palestrina, he's a great musician, and we want you to write a bunch of homophonic music. Okay, he goes away. He comes back, and okay, he has written a certain amount of homophonic music, but he's also written a certain amount of polyphonic music, which is what they told him they were going to get rid of. Well, okay, except he does make some changes. For one, this they're not using this different words in different voices. They're using one set of words. Okay, and whenever you have new words, you sing it either solo or homophonic, so you can hear the words. Now, if you repeat the words, then at that point he felt it was okay to go off into a polyphonic fantasy, if you will. So that's only for words that were repeated because we already know what's being said, right? So homophonic, but then this new type of polyphonic music, and plus really gorgeous arcing lines, real smooth and beautiful, very diatonic, meaning simple scale, so that everybody could follow. And yeah, these were the changes he made. He goes back to the Vatican. They say, "Well, that's not what we asked you to do, but this is pretty beautiful. It really is." So they kept it, and this becomes the template. Basically, Palestrina lays down the template for the music in the Catholic Church for a long, long time. Okay. Okay. Now from there, we're going to move over to the secular side of things. Now that it's okay to write secular music, dance tunes, love songs. The most important secular music was easily the madrigal. Uh, Now there is a 14th century type of madrigal, but when you say madrigal, people get it. We're talking Renaissance madrigals, okay? This period of history madrigals. They are secular, so they're love songs and dance tunes, and well, I mean, you could dance it. They have a beat, and they use just voices ostensibly. Now, when we say a cappella, as in chapel, we think in terms of the church prohibition against instruments in the chapel. Well, okay, these madrigals are written for just voices. This is a chamber group, okay, because three, four, maybe five voices, and they would sing in a house or a foyer or something like that. However, at least technically, that's what you're supposed to do. In practice, let's say the bass is sick. What do we do? Well, maybe somebody plays bassoon. So they come in and they play bassoon with that part. So there was this really kind of this pickup group kind of attitude. But nevertheless, it was supposed to be just for voices. So when you guys go see madrigals at a choir concert, I mean, that's not wrong, but that's not what they were originally intended for. They were intended for only one voice per part for three, four, maybe five voices, and each part was different, okay? Now, when you have two or more voices per part, of course, that is by definition orchestral or choral, okay? So, but that's all right. I mean, they still sound good, but that's not what they were intentionally originally intended to do. Italy, of course, is the center of this development, but we also give credit to England too. The rest of Europe was just happy to do what Italy did. Hey, they're the first and they're the best. Okay. But as often happens, the English thought they had their own idea how to do this. So what did they do? Well, they took the madrigal form and they changed it to their own tastes. One, they put it in English so they could understand the words. But for two, the topics were a little different. A lot of times, I mean, they still had love songs and stuff like that. But um, one of the things they often did was to write songs that talked about Fair Oriana or the Shepherd Queen or stuff like this. Well, these are all dedications to Queen Elizabeth. England during this time, the performances were often being shut down by people who thought they were lascivious, or of course, and also there was outbreaks of plague, and you don't want a bunch of people standing together in the theater when you have plague or other diseases. But the reason a lot of these people could keep going is because Queen Elizabeth I, uh, sponsored them. She was a patron, and even brought a lot of them to the palace to perform and stuff. So they kissed up a little bit. That's just kind of what you do if you want to keep going, right? And you got somebody with money and power to help keep you going. So uh, this is what they were doing a lot with the words, changing them to wink, wink, nudge, nudge. It's about Queen Elizabeth, the Shepherd Queen. Okay. Um, Now, in terms of the form, this poem, the last line, and I don't know if we've the Greeks in their theater and stuff, what they would do is they would do a scene with one, two, or three people, and then the chorus would come out, and they would either give you a summary or a moral of the story is. Okay, and let you know what was intended for that scene to get across. You should recognize this if you're familiar with Aesop's fables. Now, actually, you are, whether you know it or not. One Aesop's fable that everybody knows is the tortoise and the hare. Okay, so they run their race, and then we give a moral of the story is don't take your victories for granted or whatever. Or yeah. So that would be the moral. This is what we mean by epigrammatic treatment of this poetry, and because that last line is more important than anything, it would get repeated, sometimes a lot. Okay, and sometimes more often than the rest of the poem. So it kind of distorts the structure of it, but nevertheless, that's how it was treated. So, and don't forget the word painting, right? Word painting was important to these, especially these madrigals. Um, Okay, and only one last thing to really talk about, and that's instruments. There's not a lot to talk about, really. Uh, there is no standardized group, no standardized orchestra, anything like that. This is very much an attitude of whatever you got, bring it, we'll jam. So when you have a pickup attitude towards music, what that means is all the music is written very generically so that anything could play it. Well, of course, that foregoes specialization, things like that. Well, as we get closer to what we now call the Baroque period, composers were experimenting with different things. Now, really, what they're doing is taking a lot of the techniques that were being used in vocal music and putting them with instruments. In some ways, though, it's more dramatic because it's easier to put a trumpet in one corner, a trumpet in another corner, and if you sit in the middle, it does seem like a very stereophonic kind of sound or echo effect, if you will. Da, 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 and that's cool, right? But mostly what they're doing is imitating what the voices were doing, choirs and stuff like this. People like Giovanni Gabrieli and others like that. There was a whole family of Gabrielis, actually. And so not only that, but also the idea that you write specific music for a specific instrument. This starts to creep into their thinkings because I promise you, you're going to write differently for a flute than you would for a tuba. Okay. So if you're going to do an arrangement, you're going to want the flute to have the characteristics that are flute-like, and a tuba to sound like the characteristics that are typical of a tuba. And so we start to see this would becomes what we're going to call orchestration. Orchestration is about this an instrument playing music written specifically for that instrument, as opposed to just a generic whoever can play this kind of thing. Um, the only thing we have besides we have dances, okay. But if you want to hear something longer, you're kind of out of luck in the Renaissance. Except if you want to jam a bunch of dances together and play them all in a row, we would call this a suite. Okay, Suite. Yeah, so a suite is a long string of dances, a lot of times contrasting. So we have some a little bit of drama there, but not a whole lot really. And that's really all that's happening with instruments. As we progress into the Baroque period, there becomes a real emphasis on specialization, but we'll talk about that in the Baroque. All right, guys, that's where I'm going to leave you with the Renaissance at this point. Those are the highlights, and then the details can be in your reading. And we'll talk about the Baroque next. See ya.